The night shift that changed my life. My name is Dr. Edward Stevens. I'm 42 years old, and I'm a general practitioner. For 16 years, I worked at the small community hospital in Cedar Ridge, a rural town in eastern Tennessee. That old brick building with its walls peeling from constant humidity and the eternal smell of disinfectant mixed with the mustiness of forgotten corners was my second home for nearly 2 decades. Built in the 80s on land that once housed an old cemetery from the community, the hospital carried in its foundations decades of interrupted stories. But it was on a cold August night in 2019 that everything changed. It was the night I discovered that some patients never really leave us, and that death sometimes is just the beginning of a journey in search of peace. The hospital operated with 24-hour emergency services, serving the entire surrounding rural region that extended for miles of dirt roads and isolated farms. I was the only doctor available that Monday morning, accompanied only by nurse technician Rose Angela, a 50-year-old woman who knew every resident of that region as if they were family. She had worked there since the hospital opened and kept in her memory stories of 3 generations of patients. The building, constructed in the 80s, had that typical public institution architecture of the era. Long, narrow corridors that seemed to extend indefinitely in the penumbra. Small rooms with high windows that let in only slivers of moonlight, and a lighting system that always left shadowy corners, no matter how many lights were turned on. The old pipes groaned within the walls, creating a constant symphony of noises that became more pronounced during the silence of the early morning hours. The routine of that early morning began like so many others. At 10 o'clock, Rose Angela meticulously organized the next day's medical records in perfectly aligned stacks, while I updated some medical reports on the old computer that took an eternity to process any command. The ceiling fan spun lazily, moving the heavy, humid air that always characterized those Tennessee winter nights. The silence of the countryside was broken only by the constant buzzing of fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally, by the irritating tick-tock of the reception area wall clock that seemed to mark time in slow motion, and by the occasional rustling of papers when a night breeze infiltrated through the poorly sealed window cracks. The smell of hand sanitizer mixed with the odor of reheated coffee that had remained in the small break room since the afternoon, creating an atmosphere that always reminded me of the inevitable passage of time in places where people came seeking relief from their pain. Around 11 o'clock, I treated my last official patient of the day, Mrs. Mary Grace, a 70-year-old woman with uncontrolled diabetes who needed medication adjustment. She left accompanied by her son-in-law, complaining about the unusual cold that had settled over the region that August week, and the hospital plunged into that peculiar silence of rural early morning when even the crickets seemed to whisper for fear of waking the sleeping world. The old trees that surrounded the building swayed gently with the cold wind, creating dancing shadows that projected on the walls through the windows, as if the building itself breathed to the rhythm of the night. It was then, exactly at 11:42, I remember precisely because I looked at the clock when the first sign happened, that I heard that sound that would forever change my perception of life and death. A shuffling of slippers down the main corridor, that unmistakable sound of someone walking slowly with difficulty, as if each step were an immense effort. The noise had a specific cadence, irregular, as if the person stopped occasionally to rest or lean on something. I raised my eyes from the paperwork and paid attention, involuntarily feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. The sound continued, methodical and dragged, clearly coming from the direction of the reception toward the examination rooms. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that the hospital was empty. Rose Angela had gone out to smoke her usual cigarette on the back porch, a ritual she religiously repeated every 2 hours during night shifts. Must be some patient who arrived, I thought, getting up from the chair and feeling the room's temperature strangely lower than moments before. Rose Angela probably didn't hear because of the wind. I walked to the reception, my own steps echoing differently in the corridor, as if the space around me had acquired a distinct acoustic quality. When I reached the waiting area, I found no one. The corridor stretched empty before me, illuminated only by the white, cold light of the fluorescence that seemed brighter than normal, creating hard, angular shadows in the corners. One of the lights flickered intermittently, producing a strobe effect that gave the area a surreal appearance. I called out loud, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the space. "Is anyone there?" The hospital is open. The silence that followed was almost palpable, dense like an invisible fog. Even the buzzing of the lights seemed to have diminished, as if the entire building were holding its breath. I waited several seconds, paying attention to any sound, but only the tick-tock of the clock continued, marking the passage of seconds. I returned to the examination room, attributing the incident to my tired imagination. After all, after 16 years doing night shifts in that isolated hospital, it wouldn't be the first time my mind played tricks. Accumulated fatigue usually creates ghosts where they don't exist, transforming normal noises into inexplicable mysteries. But a part of me, that primitive intuition we all carry, whispered that something had changed in the atmosphere of the place. 20 minutes later, exactly when I was beginning to relax and attribute the previous incident to imagination, the sound returned, this time clearer and impossible to ignore. Slippers shuffling across the cold ceramic floor, accompanied by something that sounded like the rustling of light fabric, as if someone wearing a hospital gown or dress were moving slowly through the corridor. The sound had a ghostly quality, as if it were produced by someone who couldn't completely lift their feet off the ground. It would stop for a few seconds, then resume, always in the same dragged and hesitant cadence, as if whoever was responsible for the noise was lost or confused. My heart accelerated perceptibly, pumping blood with more force through my veins, while a cold sensation spread down my neck. I took a flashlight from the desk drawer. The hospital had several, as power outages were frequent in the region due to strong winds that knocked down power lines, and followed the sound. This time, I was absolutely certain it was coming from the examination room wing, specifically from the direction of the procedure room where we performed dressings and minor surgeries. As I approached, the temperature seemed to drop drastically. The cold wasn't just physical. There was something supernatural about it, a coldness that penetrated to the bones and made my breath form a visible mist in the air, which was completely anomalous considering we were in Tennessee's relatively mild winter, where temperatures rarely dropped that much. The rustling of fabric intensified, as if someone were standing right behind the procedure room door, moving nervously from one foot to the other. The door was ajar, letting escape a sliver of darkness that seemed denser than normal. I turned the handle slowly, feeling the cold metal under my sweaty palm, and opened the door completely. The room was empty, but something was fundamentally different. The examination table that always stood against the right wall was positioned in the center of the room, with a white sheet perfectly spread over it, as if it had been prepared to receive a patient. The edges of the sheet fell in geometrically perfect folds, as if someone had dedicated special time and care to the task. I was absolutely certain that when I left there earlier, after performing a dressing on a child who had hurt himself playing, the table was in its usual place against the wall and completely without a sheet. Moreover, the medication cabinet, which we always kept locked for security reasons, was slightly open, and I could see some bottles organized in a way I didn't recognize. The smell of the room had also changed. Besides the usual odor of disinfectant, there was something more subtle, like talcum powder and cologne, an old-fashioned perfume that reminded me of the elderly ladies who frequented the hospital. I felt an intense shiver run down my spine, starting at the base of my neck and descending like cold fingers to my waist. Someone had been there, moved things, prepared the room. But who and why? And more importantly, how had they entered without me noticing? I called for Rose Angela with more urgency in my voice, but got no response. I quickly headed to the back of the hospital to look for her, my steps echoing strangely in the corridor that seemed to have lengthened since the last time I passed through there. When I reached the back porch, I found it empty. Her half-smoked cigarette was still releasing a thin trail of smoke in the makeshift ashtray on the railing, as if she had just left. The ember was still lit, indicating she had abandoned the place less than a minute ago. But where to? It was at that moment that I heard her voice coming from the main corridor, but there was something deeply wrong with the tone. "Dr. Stevens, can you come here, please?" The voice was different, deeper than usual, with a contained urgency that didn't match her always calm and controlled personality. There was an echoing quality to it, as if she were speaking from very far away or through a tunnel. I returned through the corridor, following the sound of her voice, but noticing that my steps seemed to produce two different types of echo, as if someone were walking parallel to me on another plane of existence. "Rose Angela, where are you?" I shouted, my voice coming out higher than I intended. "Here at reception, doctor. There's a patient wanting to be seen." When I reached the reception, I found Rose Angela standing behind the counter, but she seemed completely transformed. Her skin had a cadaverous pallor I had never seen before, and her eyes were fixed on a specific point in the waiting room, as if she were observing someone with an intensity that bordered on trance. Her hands trembled slightly while holding an intake form that was completely blank, but which she filled out with automatic movements, writing words I couldn't distinguish. An expression I had never seen on her face, a mixture of confusion, apprehension, and something that seemed to be recognition, dominated her features. "Where is the patient?" I asked, looking around the empty waiting room, but feeling an almost tangible presence in the air. Rose Angela blinked several times in a row, as if she were slowly coming out of a deep trance. When her eyes finally focused on me, she seemed confused about her own location. I thought that there was a lady here. Mrs. Amelia. She said she was having chest pains and asked for you to see her. She was sitting there," she pointed to one of the waiting room chairs, "and talked about how her chest was tight, just like that night." "Mrs. Amelia?" I frowned, feeling a strange cold settling in the pit of my stomach. The name sounded deeply familiar, but I was struggling to locate the reference in my memory. Last name? Amelia Roberts. That short lady, always in a floral dress and old slippers. She came here every week to check her blood pressure, always sat in the same chair, always brought a small bag of honey candies to offer to other people in line. The blood literally froze in my veins, and I felt as if an invisible hand had squeezed my throat. I knew Mrs. Amelia Roberts very well, a kind and religious lady, widowed for more than a decade, who really came to the hospital weekly for hypertension control. She always arrived punctually on Thursday mornings, wearing her handmade floral dresses and the leather slippers she had received from her late husband. She was a gentle woman who treated everyone with maternal cordiality and never forgot to ask about the staff's families. But Mrs. Amelia had died exactly 3 years ago. Massive heart attack at home on a cold August morning almost identical to the one we were experiencing. "Rose Angela," my voice came out lower and more tremulous than I intended. "Mrs. Amelia died 3 years ago." The nurse looked at me with an expression of growing incredulity, as if I was speaking a foreign language. "No, doctor. She was here just now. She spoke to me, asked to be seen with that sweet voice of hers. She said she was feeling her chest tighten a lot, just like that night, the night she tried to get here but couldn't." "Now what night, Rose Angela? What are you talking about?" "The night she died, doctor. Don't you remember? You were the one who confirmed the death when the family brought her body here the next morning." The memory returned like a brutal punch to the stomach, bringing with it details I had tried to forget. I remembered perfectly now with painful clarity. A cold August morning in 2016, very similar to the one we were experiencing. Mrs. Amelia's family brought her lifeless body to the hospital, carrying her in the back seat of a faded blue Volkswagen Beetle, desperately hoping for a miracle I couldn't perform. She had died alone in her small wooden house on the outskirts of the district, desperately trying to reach the telephone to ask for help. When her daughter found her the next morning, Mrs. Amelia was lying in the hallway of her house, still wearing the floral nightgown she used to sleep in, and the old slippers she always wore. Her right hand was extended toward the telephone, just a few inches from the device that could have saved her life. The same slippers I had heard shuffling through the hospital corridor. "You need a break, Rose Angela. Fatigue sometimes makes us see things." "Doctor," she interrupted me, her voice trembling with an intensity I had never heard before. She said she came back because she never managed to ask for help in time that night. She said she kept trying to reach the telephone, then tried to leave the house to come here, but her legs wouldn't obey and her chest hurt so much she could barely breathe. And now she managed to get here, managed to ask for help. A heavy and oppressive silence settled between us, charged with a tension that seemed to materialize in the air around us. Rose Angela was an absolutely sensible person, an experienced professional who had worked in healthcare for more than 20 years. She had seen births, deaths, medical emergencies of all kinds, and had never shown any tendency toward fantasies or superstitions. If she was telling me this with such conviction, there was a very real reason behind her words. "Where did you say she was sitting?" Rose Angela pointed with a trembling hand to one of the waiting room chairs, near the window that faced the inner courtyard. "There, sitting in the third chair of the first row. The same one where she always sat when she came for appointments. She even had that little bag of honey candies she always brought." I walked slowly to the indicated chair, each step echoing abnormally loud in the silence of the room. When I approached the seat, several things caught my attention simultaneously. The seat of the plastic chair was visibly warm, as if someone had really been there until a few minutes before. There was a slight depression in the thin cushion, as if a person's weight had been marked there. But what impressed me most was the smell, an unmistakable perfume of talcum powder and Avon cologne, exactly what Mrs. Amelia used to wear, mixed with a sweet aroma of honey candies. And then I saw on the floor beside the chair, there were some transparent honey candy wrappers, as if someone had opened the bag and offered the sweets to other imaginary patients. "Doctor!" Rose Angela's voice sounded behind me, even lower and charged with a gravity that made all the hairs on my body stand up. "There's something else I need to tell you." I turned slowly to face her, already fearing what was to come. "What else, Rose Angela?" She wasn't alone in the waiting room. My stomach contracted as if I had been punched. There were 2 more people waiting to be seen, Mr. Michael Ferguson and Mrs. Constance Smith. All of them what, Rose Angela? Finish the sentence. "All died here at the hospital, doctor, or tried to get here before dying, and they were sitting in their usual chairs, waiting patiently to be seen, as if it were a normal day of appointments." My rational mind, trained in years of medical school and specialization, desperately tried to find a logical explanation for all of this. Collective hallucination, perhaps, caused by some gas leak or ventilation problem in the old building. Intoxication by some chemical substance used in cleaning. Post-traumatic stress manifesting in an unprecedented way. But deep down, a more primitive and intuitive part of me already knew I was dealing with something that completely transcended the limits of medical and scientific understanding. Mr. Michael had died 2 years before, victim of a massive stroke. In the weeks preceding his death, he had reported persistent headaches and episodes of dizziness, but attributed the symptoms to overwork on the farm. On the night of his death, he felt the symptoms worsen drastically and tried to drive his old pickup truck to the hospital, but lost consciousness on the way and crashed the vehicle into a century-old tree just 200 meters from the hospital. When they found him the next morning, he was still in the driver's seat, with one hand on the steering wheel and the other toward the door, as if he were trying to get out of the car to continue walking to the hospital. Mrs. Constance had died the previous year, victim of severe pneumonia, after fighting the disease for 3 weeks at home because she was afraid of hospitals. Her last appointment had been with me on a humid Friday afternoon, when she still showed signs of improvement. I recommended she continue taking the antibiotics and return on Monday for re-evaluation. When I returned to work the following Monday, I learned through Rose Angela that she had died over the weekend. The family said that in her last moments, she kept repeating that she needed to return to the hospital to talk to Dr. Stevens about something important she had forgotten to mention. "Rose Angela, I'm going to call Dr. Marcus to cover my shift. I think we'd better leave here before things get worse." "It won't help, doctor," she replied with a disturbing certainty. "What do you mean? Why won't it help?" "They won't leave until they're seen." "That's what they want. That's why they managed to come back. One last appointment, an opportunity to talk about what's disturbing them." Before I could respond or question the supernatural logic of that statement, the hospital's sound system crackled with a sharp electrical interference, followed by a female voice that echoed through the speakers, spread throughout the building. It was a fragile and distant voice, as if it were being transmitted through a great distance or from another dimension. "Dr. Stevens, my chest is hurting a lot. It's tightening like that night. Can you see me, please? I walked so far to get here." It was unmistakably Mrs. Amelia's voice, every inflection, every modulation of the heavy accent, and the polite and respectful way she always addressed doctors. Rose Angela and I looked at each other, both perfectly recognizing the voice we had heard hundreds of times during years of routine appointments. "Dr. Stevens?" The voice returned to echo through the speakers, weaker this time, as if it were moving away. "I've been waiting so long. Since that night, I've been trying to reach you." My scientific training entered frontal and irreconcilable conflict with what I was witnessing, but something deeper within me, perhaps the compassion I learned in years of medicine or a spiritual intuition I had never recognized before, made me think that if it really were Mrs. Amelia seeking help after death, she deserved to be heard. After all, she had spent her last conscious moments of life desperately trying to get medical attention, and died in the anguishing solitude of someone who couldn't ask for help in time. Where is she now? I asked Rosangela, my voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. Examination room 2. That's where you always saw her. She must be waiting there. I walked slowly toward the examination room, each step echoing in the silent corridor like a funeral drum. My feet seemed to weigh tons, and the temperature continued strangely low, making me able to see my breath condensing in the air in small vapor clouds. As I approached the door of examination room 2, I noticed a soft light emanating from under the crack. Not the white, cold light of the usual fluorescence, but something more yellowish and warm, almost golden, like candlelight or a very old incandescent bulb. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could hear a low rhythmic sound, as if someone were breathing with difficulty or trying to control pain. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I could find, and opened the door slowly. Mrs. Amelia was sitting in the patient chair, exactly as if it were an absolutely normal appointment. She wore her usual floral nightgown, the same one she wore the night she died, and the worn leather slippers I remembered so well. Her greyish hair was combed with the same meticulous care as always, tied in a low bun with simple clips. She held in her hands an embroidered fabric handkerchief, which she folded and unfolded nervously, and smiled at me with that gentle and respectful expression I remembered perfectly. But there was something profoundly different in her eyes, a depth that went beyond normal human experience, a sadness that transcended any physical pain I had ever treated in 16 years of medicine. It was like looking into an infinite well of suffering and longing. "Dr. Stevens," she spoke, her voice sounding like a distant echo that reverberated through dimensions I couldn't understand. "Thank you so much for seeing me. I know it's late at night, but my chest is hurting so much, just like that night when I couldn't get here." I sat slowly in my usual chair on the other side of the desk, feeling as if I were participating in a sacred ritual that completely escaped my understanding. A part of me was still frantically trying to rationalize the situation, looking for neurological or psychiatric explanations for what I was experiencing. But a larger and wiser part had accepted that I was participating in something that transcended the limits of the reality I knew, something that belonged to a realm where medicine and spirituality met in an inexplicable way. "How long have you been feeling this pain, Mrs. Amelia?" I asked, automatically adopting the professional and compassionate tone I used in all appointments. "Since that night, doctor. Since the night I died alone in my house." Her words were said with a disturbing naturalness, as if she were reporting symptoms of a common cold. "I tried so hard to get here when I felt the pain starting, but my legs couldn't carry me. And the pain was so much that I couldn't even scream for help. I just tried to drag my feet through the hallway of my house, trying to reach the telephone. Tears began to flow down my face without my being able to control them. The image of that gentle and religious lady, dying alone at home, fighting against the unbearable pain of a heart attack and desperately trying to seek help that never came, broke my heart in a way that no medical tragedy had achieved before. It was as if I could feel through her all the anguish and desperation of her last moments of life. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Amelia. I'm sorry I wasn't there to help you that night. It wasn't your fault, doctor. You were always a very good doctor to me, always treated me with care and respect. But I needed you to know, I needed someone to know that I tried to fight, that I didn't give up without fighting until the last moment. I know, Mrs. Amelia, you were very brave. You were always a strong and hard-working woman." She smiled, and for a moment her appearance became more translucent, as if she were slowly dissolving at the edges, like a photograph that gradually loses focus. "Can I go in peace now, doctor? Can I rest?" "You can go in peace, Mrs. Amelia. You were a dear patient, a special person, and you will never be forgotten by us. Be sure that your memory will always be honored. Thank you so much, Dr. Stevens. You always knew how to listen to people with your heart." She rose slowly from the chair, moving with that characteristic difficulty I remembered from her appointments, when hypertension and age were already beginning to take their physical toll. She took a few shuffled steps toward the door, then turned to me one last time. "Dr. Stevens, the others also need to be heard. They've been waiting so long, carrying their own pain and regrets. They trust you." And then she gradually disappeared, as if she were dissolving in the air, leaving only the gentle and familiar smell of talcum powder and cologne, mixed with the sweet aroma of honey candies. I left the examination room with trembling legs, and my heart beating irregularly, feeling as if I had participated in an inexplicable miracle that defied everything I learned about the nature of life and death. I found Rosangela at the reception, standing motionless like a statue, her eyes fixed on the corridor that led to the other examination rooms. She looked at me with an expression that mixed deep fear, understanding, and a strange serenity. "Did she go?" Rosangela asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, but she said there are others waiting. Mr. Michael is in examination room 1. I can hear him walking back and forth, like he did when he was nervous. Mrs. Constance is in the procedure room. She coughs from time to time, that dry cough she had in the last days before dying." The sentence hung in the air between us, loaded with a weight that seemed to materialize in the environment around us. During the next 3 hours, I lived the most extraordinary, disturbing, and transformative experience of my medical career. I saw 3 patients who had died years before, each bringing their own emotional pain, their own regret, their own desperate need to be heard and understood. Mr. Michael was in examination room 1, walking restlessly around the small room, exactly as he used to do when he was worried about some health problem. He was a tall, thin man, 65 years old, who had worked his entire life as a farmer. He had always been a difficult patient, resistant to treatments and reluctant to follow medical recommendations. When I entered the room, he turned to me with that stubborn expression I knew so well. "Dr. Stevens, I know you're going to be mad at me, but I need to tell you something." I sat down and invited him to do the same. Like Mrs. Amelia, Mr. Michael had an ethereal, translucent quality, but his obstinate personality remained intact. "I'm not going to be mad, Mr. Michael. Tell me what's bothering you." "Doctor, in the weeks before I died, I was feeling some strange things. Headache that wouldn't go away with any medicine, dizziness when I got up fast, and there was one time I forgot my own granddaughter's name. But I didn't want to come here because..." He paused, lowering his head with shame. "Because I was afraid you'd tell me to stop working." My heart tightened when I understood the magnitude of the tragedy. Mr. Michael had ignored clear signs of severe hypertension and possible mini-strokes because he was afraid of losing his independence. He was a widower, lived alone, and work on the farm was all he had left of identity and purpose. "I died blaming myself, doctor, thinking that if I had come here, maybe you could have helped me. But I was too proud, too stubborn." "Mr. Michael," I replied, feeling tears burn my eyes again, "you didn't die from stubbornness. You died because you were afraid of losing your dignity. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to maintain your independence. But I could have lived longer, doctor. I could have seen my granddaughter graduate. Maybe, or maybe not. Medicine isn't an exact science, and you know that. What's important is that you lived with dignity, worked honestly your whole life, and left an example of strength for your family." He looked at me with eyes that carried decades of hard work and responsibility. "Do you think I can forgive myself?" "I think you've already forgiven yourself, Mr. Michael. Otherwise you wouldn't be here seeking peace." He smiled for the first time since I entered the room, a smile that illuminated his transparent face. "Thank you, doctor. Now I can rest." And like Mrs. Amelia, he gradually dissolved, leaving only the familiar smell of earth and honest sweat that always accompanied him. Mrs. Constance was in the procedure room, sitting in the chair where she always received nebulizations during her pneumonia treatment. She was a 72-year-old woman, a retired teacher, who had dedicated her life to educating the district's children. She had always been an exemplary patient, followed all prescriptions to the letter and never missed appointments. When I entered the room, she was coughing softly, the same dry cough that characterized her last days of life. "Mrs. Constance?" I greeted her using the title she always preferred, since she had been principal of the local school for 30 years. "Dr. Stevens, I made a terrible mistake." "What mistake, Mrs. Constance?" "In the last days, when I was feeling a little better, I stopped taking the antibiotics. I thought I was already cured, that I didn't need them anymore, and the pneumonia came back worse." She paused to cough, a cough that echoed strangely in the small room. "I died thinking I had disappointed you, that I had wasted all your work, and worse still, thinking I had disappointed my family. They spent so much money on me, worried so much." Mrs. Constance had died carrying a guilt that didn't belong to her. In fact, her initial recovery had been exceptional for pneumonia at her age, and the recurrence was a consequence of her own immune system's fragility, not any failure of hers. "Mrs. Constance, you didn't disappoint anyone. Medicine is like that, full of ups and downs. What's important is that you fought, that you followed the treatment the best way you could. But I stopped taking the medicine. And why did you stop? Because I was feeling so good that I thought I didn't need it anymore. And because the family was already spending so much, there was the real problem. Mrs. Constance had interrupted the treatment not from negligence, but from excessive concern about the financial impact on the family. It was a common dilemma in low-income families where medications represent a significant portion of the budget. You did the best you could with the resources you had. No responsible doctor could blame you for that. I so wanted to have talked to you about this concern about money. Maybe we could have found an alternative. Maybe. But the past can't be changed. What matters is that you were always a generous person who dedicated your life to educating children. Your family loved you exactly as you were. She smiled through the tears that flowed down her translucent face. Thank you, Doctor. I needed to hear that. Like the others, Mrs. Constance gradually dissolved, leaving a gentle smell of school chalk and floral perfume that always accompanied her. When the last patient said goodbye, it was almost 5:30 in the morning. The first light of day was beginning to filter through the hospital windows, bringing with it that golden and comforting light that announces the end of the night shadows. The heavy and supernatural atmosphere that had dominated the last hours began to dissipate gradually, as if the first rays of sun had the power to dissolve the boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead. Rosangela and I sat in the reception in silence for almost an hour, processing what we had experienced. There were no words in human vocabulary to adequately describe that experience, and we both instinctively knew that if we told anyone, we would be considered victims of post-traumatic stress or mental exhaustion. Doctor, Rosangela finally broke the silence, her voice still charged with reverence for what we had witnessed. Do you think they'll come back? No. I think they just needed to be heard, needed to know that their deaths mattered, that they were remembered with affection and respect. Now they can rest in peace. And us? How do we continue after a night like this? How do we return to normal routine, knowing that there are things beyond our understanding? It was a deep and disturbing question. How would a doctor deal with the absolute certainty that some patients transcend death? How would this change my medical practice, my understanding of life and death, my responsibility as a healer? How would I continue practicing a fundamentally scientific profession after having experienced something that challenged all the principles of modern science? I think we become more human, I replied after a long reflection. More aware that our profession goes far beyond prescribing medications and making diagnoses. Sometimes, all someone needs is to be heard, to be treated with dignity, even when it's too late for any physical cure. In the weeks and months following the supernatural experience, I drastically changed my way of practicing medicine. The transformation was so radical that other colleagues began commenting on my new approach, some with admiration, others with skepticism. I began dedicating significantly more time to each appointment, listening not only to the physical symptoms my patients reported, but also to the deep fears, family concerns, guilt, and regrets they carried as invisible weights. I realized that many diseases had deep emotional roots, and that truly effective treatment needed to consider the human being as an integrated whole, body, mind, and spirit. I implemented a practice I internally called medicine of the soul. I reserved the last 15 minutes of each appointment to talk with patients about their lives, their families, their dreams, and their concerns. It was impressive how many of them opened up when they realized I was genuinely interested in hearing them as people, not just as clinical cases. Mrs. Mary Johnson, an 80-year-old woman with diabetes, revealed during one of these conversations that she was neglecting her medication because she felt like a burden to her family. Her only son worked 2 jobs to pay for the medicines, and she preferred to feel sick rather than cause more expenses. After a long conversation, we managed to find a government program that provided the medications for free. Mr. Anthony, a 55-year-old farmer with hypertension, confessed that he wasn't taking his medicines because he believed they would make him weak and unable to work. We spent an hour talking about how medication would actually make him stronger, allowing him to work safely for more years. Rosangela was also profoundly transformed by the experience. She became even more attentive to the emotional needs of patients, especially the elderly who came to the hospital carrying not only physical diseases, but also deep loneliness and existential fear of death. She developed an almost supernatural ability to identify patients who were going through emotional crises and always found time to sit with them and offer a word of comfort. Together, we created a kind of unofficial protocol to identify and support patients who might be going through difficult moments similar to those that Mrs. Amelia, Mr. Michael, and Mrs. Constance had faced. We began making more frequent home visits, especially to elderly people who lived alone in isolated rural areas. We established a support network with community leaders, health agents, and even local business owners, so that everyone would be alert to signs that someone might need medical or emotional help. Cedar Ridge Hospital gradually became known throughout the region, not only for the technical quality of medical care, but also for the humanized and comprehensive care we offered. Patients began traveling longer distances to be treated there, not because we had more modern equipment or more expensive medications, but because they knew they would be treated as complete human beings with their emotional and spiritual complexities. Other healthcare professionals in the region began seeking us out to understand our methods. Whenever possible, we shared our philosophy of comprehensive care, emphasizing the importance of truly listening to patients and treating not just symptoms, but the people behind them. We never mentioned, of course, the supernatural origin of this transformation, but we talked about how profound experiences can change our perspective on what it means to be a healer. There were other strange and inexplicable nights over the following years, but none compared to that August morning that changed everything. Sometimes, especially during solitary night shifts, I felt familiar presences walking through the hospital corridors. I could hear soft footsteps, doors opening and closing by themselves, or the rustling of old fabrics. Occasionally I found objects out of place without apparent explanation. A moved chair, a sheet perfectly folded on an examination table that was messy, or the sudden smell of old perfumes in empty rooms. But I never again had direct contact with deceased patients. I sincerely believe that Mrs. Amelia, Mr. Michael, and Mrs. Constance were the spiritual spokespersons for many others who departed in peace after our conversation that transformative night. Perhaps that was exactly what they needed, not just to be heard individually, but to know that their experience would serve as a catalyst to improve care for other patients who would come after them. The experience also changed my perspective on death itself. As a doctor, I had always viewed death as the enemy to be fought, the final failure of medicine. But after that night, I began to understand death as a natural transition, and my role as a doctor expanded to include not only healing when possible, but also comfort and dignity during the passage. I began talking more openly with terminal patients about their fears and hopes. I discovered that many of them carried guilt, similar to what our supernatural visitors had expressed: regrets about medical decisions, concerns about the impact of their illnesses on families, or fear of being forgotten after death. These conversations became some of the most meaningful of my career. Helping someone find peace with themselves in the face of imminent death proved to be as important as prescribing medications or performing medical procedures. In 2023, after 20 years of work at Cedar Ridge Hospital, I officially retired from public service, but continued seeing patients in a private practice in Nashville. Rose Angela took over nursing coordination at the hospital and successfully implemented several home care and emotional support programs we developed together over the years. She became a regional reference in humanized care, frequently invited to give lectures at other hospitals. My private practice maintains the same philosophy of comprehensive care we developed after that transformative night. I reserve enough time for each patient, listen to their complete stories, and treat not only physical symptoms, but also the emotional and spiritual issues that are often behind illnesses. Occasionally, when I drive past the dirt road that leads to Cedar Ridge Hospital, I feel a strange and comforting nostalgia for that night that changed not only my career, but my fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. It's not fear. It never was fear, actually. It's a deep mixture of gratitude and reverence for having been chosen to live that unique and transformative experience. Modern medicine, with all its advanced technology and scientific knowledge, taught me much about the functioning of the human body, about diseases and treatments, about the fragility of physical life. But it was on a haunted August morning, in an isolated hospital in rural Tennessee, that I learned the most important lessons about true compassion, about the continuity of love and care beyond death, and about how small gestures of humanity can heal wounds that no medication is capable of reaching. Today, at 58 years old, I keep in my office a framed photograph of the old Cedar Ridge Hospital. It's not just a sentimental reminder of 20 years of hard and dedicated work, but a constant reminder that somewhere between rigorous science and inexplicable mystery, between the rational and the transcendent, there exists a sacred space where doctors and patients meet as equal human beings, sharing the universal journey of life, death, and everything that exists beyond both. Sometimes, especially on cold August nights when the Tennessee winter brings that humid and silent cold that penetrates to the bones, I still hear distant echoes of slippers shuffling across the floor, the soft rustling of old fabrics moved by supernatural breezes, and gentle and familiar voices calling my name through the dimensions. But it's not a sound that haunts me or disturbs my sleep. It's a sound that deeply comforts me, reminding me that true love and genuine care never die. They just transform and continue to exist in forms that our science still cannot understand or explain. And when that happens, I whisper a small silent prayer of gratitude to Mrs. Amelia, Mr. Michael, Mrs. Constance, and all the other patients who trusted me not only with their physical health, but also their deepest fears, their most intimate hopes, and, in the end, their vulnerable souls. Because I discovered that transformative night that being a doctor is not just about healing sick bodies or prescribing medications. It is, above all, honoring the eternal and sacred dignity of the human spirit, even when it no longer dwells among us on this plane of existence. To this day, when I pass by the old Cedar Ridge Hospital, I feel that they still watch me with affection. But it's no longer a disturbing or threatening feeling. It's the deeply comforting sensation of being remembered with affection by those I had the invaluable privilege of serving, both in life and in death. And that perhaps is the greatest gift a doctor can receive throughout his career, knowing that his care transcended the conventional boundaries of time and physical existence, and that somewhere, in some spiritual dimension I don't completely understand, there are still patients who consider me with pride and gratitude, their doctor for all eternity. Subscribe to Darkness Activity for more supernatural stories that will chill your soul. Like, comment about your paranormal experience, and explore our other terrifying videos. We want to know, have you ever experienced something inexplicable? Tell us about it.